when relevant. So that's just to notify you of that. So I'll hand over to Dan now if you want to get started. Dan, thank you so much in advance for the presentation.
No, amazing. Thank you. Thanks very much for organising it and for having me in to deliver to the students, and then also for having me in to talk to parents as well. It's something I'm obviously very passionate about, so very happy to do. Yeah, so I'll kind of introduce myself and talk consent in a bit, but I suppose just before we start, just I guess talk about how this probably will work best is I'll go through kind of the presentation, I'll go through sort of what we're going to talk about in a second, and then probably the easiest is if we save questions till the end, just because I can't see anyone's camera at this point, so it'd probably be easier for me to just do the whole presentation. If there are any questions at the end, I'm more than happy to answer. The other side of that as well is that I do have a sort of resource pack that I'll send over to Faith afterwards, so then she can send it around to any of the parents, all the parents as well, just to kind of follow up on this, to provide extra information and also help answer any questions. But yeah, so we'll make a start. Obviously, as we can see here, my name's Dan. I'm from Talk Consent. Talk Consent provides very effective education to schools around the UK to help end sexual violence. So essentially, just on top of that, as you can see as well, Talk Consent, that's what we do. Just for a bit of background, we've now been going for just over 2 years, and mostly in and around London, but we've now delivered to over 200 schools in the UK, and that means just over 65,000 students roughly at this point. So we're growing quite a lot. We're delivering to lots of different schools, and we're getting really good feedback from those, and we're hopefully making a real impact. That's just, I guess, a bit of context, and then that's me there, Dan Allchurch. I founded Talk Consent about 2 years ago, having graduated from university, and it's obviously something, this kind of the aim of Talk Consent, ending sexual violence, the mission that we have, is something I feel very, very passionate about. So very important, I think, to talk to lots of different students, but also talk to parents and teachers as well, so that we can continue the conversation. So what we'll kind of talk about, why I'm talking to you first, is I'll go through the context of why this is important. After that, we'll kind of go through what, as parents, you guys can be doing, / the conversations you can be having with your students, with your children. After this, so kind of the way that you can continue this conversation, and incorporated into that, I'll give context and I'll talk about what we delivered to the students both this year and also last year, because we delivered assemblies last year at Cox Green as well. After that, we'll kind of talk a bit about, wider context around the issue, so what sexual violence means, but also the various things that we can be looking out for in terms of attitudes, beliefs, and culture, so not just the actual actions. And then kind of finishing on what sort of a bit of advice, I guess, if people have children who end up being a victim of something or going through something very difficult, which obviously is very hard to talk about, but I think helpful to give that advice in case it does happen. And then at the end, we can take any questions. So I'll kind of go through it. Hopefully it all makes sense, and obviously happy to answer any questions as we go through it. And then, as I said, I'll provide the resource afterwards, just to make sure we can follow up on that. And if there's any information, I'm also happy to share these slides as well, plus the slides that we delivered to the students if people would like those. So just to start with, why am I here? Why am I talking to you? Also, why did I talk to students? And in general, the main reason is because, unfortunately, in the UK, we have a really significant issue with sexual violence. And people are probably aware of that. Some people might not be, but I think it's really helpful just to reiterate that and talk about. So on that, in the UK, 4 in 5 women are sexually harassed at some point in their lifetime. 1 in 7 people are sexually assaulted. 1 in 7 men have felt coerced into having sex with somebody. And more than 1 in 20 women are raped. Obviously, these are very shocking and very horrible statistics to read, and it can be very difficult, but it's so important that we're all aware of how significant a problem this is. And on top of that, I think we need to understand that it's not just what we often stereotypically see as the problem. And what I mean by that is we often see on, TV and in media and the news that it's like a stranger down a dark alleyway who's trying to do something, who's trying to hurt someone else, who's basically set out that day and planned it. That's obviously does happen and it's horrible, but is relatively quite rare. So most of the time, it's actually people who know each other. And linking to that is something we need to, as a result, realize young people really do face this issue as well. It's not just adults. So as I said, 90% of the time, perpetrators are known to the victim beforehand. 63% of the time, it takes place at either the home of the victim or the perpetrator, so not somewhere that we would often expect it to happen. And 16 to 19-year-olds are 4 times more likely to be a victim than the average person. Now, again, I'm not putting these statistics out there and saying these kind of things to sort of scare people or shock people. We say the same things to the students when we show it to them. The reason we're talking about it is because it's so important that everyone understands that this is an issue that we're facing, and it's an issue that young people are facing, and therefore they've got to take it seriously. So they've got to understand it's a problem, but most importantly, they've just got to be really careful with consent, or careful if and when they do get involved in relationships or sexual activity, just to make sure we're not adding to those statistics. Because I think we can all agree we don't want anyone to be going through that kind of thing. On top of that, this is obviously why it's really important to be having these conversations. I firmly believe that one of the significant reasons this is so common, and particularly amongst young people, is because we're just not really often aware of it and we're not talking about it enough. Whereas if we can kind of make sure it's a widely held conversation and we can all understand that it's an issue, I think then everyone will hopefully be a bit more active in trying to reduce this and bring the numbers down. So that's why it's really important for me to be here, and I think also for all parents to be listening to this. So as a parent, in terms of, like, as I've just said, it's obviously important that we talk about this. What can you do? And the main thing, along with just supporting children, is to talk about consent and to talk about sexual violence and to talk about these issues. Now, obviously, we've talked to students quite a lot about these kind of things. So the main thing here is just saying, okay, how can you continue the conversation? And just linked to this, if you don't talk about it, or if we don't talk about it, then it's okay, well, how will they learn otherwise? Because they've got to learn somehow how to get involved in relationships and sexual activity in a safe way. And either that's learned by experience, which means potentially getting it wrong. And as we'll kind of talked about, the stakes of getting it wrong in a real life situation are so high. So if it's not that, then it might be through porn. Unfortunately, a lot of research is coming out now that young people are watching porn partly to learn about what to do, because they're not getting better education elsewhere. And that's obviously a significant problem, because I think, as most people will be aware, pornography is incredibly unrealistic. It doesn't depict consent, and often it depicts very violent acts. As a result, if people are learning from this and thinking that that's normal and that's how real life sexual situations work, that's going to be really problematic. So that's one problem. Secondly, they might be learning from social media. Again, lots of different sources on there, which are going to be very unreliable, and it's potentially not going to be the best advice that they get, which can lead to significant issues. It might be friends, and again, that can be really helpful in some ways, that friends talk about these things and kind of make sure they all understand different ideas. However, also it can be a bit of a problem, in particular if friends aren't necessarily getting information from good sources either, or just fundamentally they won't really learn about this stuff properly. Either they'll have a lack of confidence going into different situations, or, as I said, they'll just have to learn by experience with a real risk of it going wrong. So as a result, it's really important that we talk about this. Now, obviously, we've started that conversation and we're trying to have that conversation as much as we can, but it needs to continue, and it can't just be us once and then nothing else. I think it's like continuing fostering this conversation. So given that, that's what I'm really here to talk about, is what can you kind of talk about and how do we continue this conversation? So number one, talk about consent, what it means and why it's important. And we'll go into that a little bit more. But the one thing I want to stress is that the legal definition is there and it can help, but it's also not the most comprehensive and helpful thing. And as we'll kind of go into, the law around this stuff isn't always the best, because legal definitions and the law has to be very black and white by definition. The way it's written, it has to, but in reality, sexual situations and relationships aren't black and white. So we need to be going a bit beyond the law, and we'll talk about that in a second. Two, we need to make sure everyone understands sexual violence in terms of what it is, what it means, and also the fact that it's a serious issue, as we kind of showed by the statistics. Make sure young people understand what healthy relationships and friendships look like, and also link to that what coercion might look like, because unfortunately that's very common amongst young people. And then also what consent looks like when in relation to alcohol/drugs. Now, obviously, I'm not talk consent itself doesn't take a stance on the use of those kind of things, because we're mostly talking about relationships. Obviously, people would give their own advice around consumption of alcohol and things like that. No matter what that advice is, obviously that's up to you. It is helpful to talk about how consent fits into those kind of things, because if people are going to be consuming alcohol and or drugs, then we need to make sure that, and potentially mixing that in with relationships, which unfortunately we know that young people sometimes do that. We need to make sure they are being as careful and as safe as possible. So those are kind of 4 things I'm going to go through today. And obviously, if there are any questions at the end, please do let me know. But the first one was consent/boundaries. So when we think about consent, the legal definition in the UK is when someone agrees to do something by choice with the freedom and capacity to make that choice. So this is what we've kind of spoken to the students about, and this is the definition we've given. Agreement and choice are normally fairly clear, fairly obvious. The only thing we tend to say about those is that it has to be their choice and no one else's. So everyone should have autonomy and choice over what happens to their body. No one else gets to tell them what they should or shouldn't do, no matter if they are in a relationship with that person, no matter if they are friends, no matter if that person is someone they think is important or they really like them, or it's a religious leader, for example, or an older family member or anything like that. When it comes to their body and anything intimate, it's really important that it's their choice and no one else's. In terms of freedom and capacity, those are the kind of 2 big ones we want to focus on. So number 1, freedom just means there are no negative consequences of saying no. So if someone feels pressured or manipulated or threatened, or for whatever reason feels like something bad is going to happen to them as a result of saying no, then they're not really free to consent. So obviously it's 2 sides of that. Is number 1, if you don't feel positive about what's going on and you do feel potentially negative about something, it's obviously you don't have to say yes to that situation. You want to be empowered to be able to say no, but equally as a result of that, we should never be putting any sort of pressure or coercion on someone else. They must be free to say yes or no to us. And then capacity just means that everyone is able to consent. So there are sort of 4 parts of this. Number 1, if you are asleep or unconscious, you obviously cannot consent. If you are incapacitated due to drugs or alcohol, then you're not able to consent. If you don't have the mental capacity, you may not be able to consent. And if you are under the legal age of consent, then technically you don't have the legal capacity. So there's a couple of things to go through on that one. Incapacitated due to drugs or alcohol obviously isn't a very clear line. So what does that exactly mean? And we'll go into alcohol later. Essentially, it's not, again, it's not a very clear, particularly with the law, it is a grey area. And so we'll kind of go into exactly how to combat that. In terms of mental capacity, we're not saying that people with mental disabilities or learning difficulties can't consent. Obviously, everyone has a right to relationships and sexual activity as much as the next person, but it is important to make sure that in the moment, everyone fully understands what they're consenting to and there isn't a power imbalance, because that's quite important. Power imbalances make consent very difficult. And then the last one was the age of consent. Now, obviously, the age of consent in the UK is 16 years old. So technically, under the eyes of the law, someone cannot consent to sexual activity until they're 16. That law was created to protect young people and not necessarily to criminalize young people. So essentially, it was created to stop people under the age of 16 being abused by people who are older than 16. As a result, if there are 2 people who are both the same age or roughly the same age, and they're both under 16 and at least 13, so they're between 13 and 15 years old inclusive, and they're roughly the same age and they consent to sexual activity, it's very unlikely that anyone's going to be prosecuted in that situation. Essentially, the police would sort of say it's not in the public interest to prosecute, because as long as they're consenting, as long as it's healthy, it's not, in reality, it's not really causing harm. However, if there's someone who's 16 or older and they're in a sexual relationship with someone who's under the age of 16, that could be considered illegal. That probably would be taken more seriously. If the perpetrator in that situation is 18 or older, that would be even more serious because they're then treated as an adult. And in general, the bigger the age gap, the more serious it gets taken. As I said before, it generally would be taken on a case-by-case basis. So, for example, we often get asked by students, what if there are two people who are both 15 and then one person turns 16 slightly before the other? In reality, again, it's unlikely that there's a power imbalance in that situation. So it's unlikely that anyone will get prosecuted, but obviously by definition, technically 16 and 15, that would be illegal. The only other thing to add to that on the age thing is that if someone is under the age of 16, they still are able to access confidential sexual health support or advice. So if they were to go to a clinic and ask for contraception or birth control or advice around this kind of thing, they wouldn't then be told by the person, oh, you're under 16, therefore I have to report you. That wouldn't happen. They'd still be able to access that. And as I kind of alluded to before as well, there is a hard barrier at 13 years old. So anyone under the age of 13 doesn't have the legal capacity to consent to sex in any situation whatsoever. So even if they said, I wanted to do it, it wouldn't be considered consent. So obviously if it was someone older with them, then that person who's older would be have very serious legal consequences, but also, and it's also not saying that if, let's say, two 12-year-olds did engage in some form of sexual activity, then they would get prosecuted, because that's unrealistic, but it would become like a serious safeguarding issue, and people would need to get involved in that kind of situation. But that's generally quite a rare case. So obviously I've spoken quite a lot there on capacity and that legal definition. Just to reiterate, the legal definition is when someone agrees to do something by choice with the freedom and capacity to make that choice. As I mentioned before, that's really helpful and it's important to know, and we do give that to students, but it's really important they go beyond just that legal definition and beyond just that idea of like a no means no and a yes means yes. And what we tend to talk about is this idea of aiming for enthusiastic consent, or again, an idea that basically everyone is comfortable doing what they're doing. They want to be doing it. They don't feel like they have to, or they don't feel pressured, or they're not just going along with it. It's like we're aiming for like a positive situation for everyone. And if that's the case, consent will be there, and consent is a part of that. So kind of to depict that a little bit more, we've got this sort of scale here, which we show to students. And the reason we show this to students is because this comes from an article written by Dr. Elsie Whittington, who studies sex and consent amongst young people. And she did a big sort of survey / a lot of focus groups talking to young people from between the ages of 13 and 20 on their attitudes to consent and relationships. And essentially what she found is that they would only label very specific and very clear things as rape or sexual assault. And that would be when someone clearly said no and didn't want to do something, and the other person forced them to do it anyway. Maybe there was violence involved. In those situations, they'd be very happy to label things as rape or sexual assault. On the other side, they would label only some stuff as very clear and as active and enthusiastic consent. If one person asked, the other person said yes, there was clear communication, conversation, and they both sort of liked each other. No problem, very clear that there's consent in that situation. Then young people basically had this big grey area in the middle where they had things such as like passive consent, which were all sort of on the green side of that scale, and then other things that they kind of would label as non-consensual sex, which would be nearer to the red side. And obviously non-consensual sex actually means, like, if sex is non-consensual, then it would be rape or sexual assault, but they basically wouldn't want to label it as that, because they found that very harsh and very binary and very kind of aggressive. So what that kind of meant was that there was things in the middle where maybe on the green side of that scale, it would be that people were kind of comfortable, they did consent, but it wasn't very clear. Communication wasn't really there, it just sort of happened, but they were okay with what happened at the end of it, and it wasn't really an issue. Versus towards the red side of that grey area, the sort of non-consensual side that I was talking about, that would basically be any situation where one person really wasn't comfortable and really didn't want to do something, but the other person doing it didn't realize that they didn't consent, or they didn't explicitly say no or make that obvious. So in that situation, that's, we're not saying that that's okay, we're not excusing it, but essentially what's happened is someone's done something they didn't necessarily mean to do, and the other person's going through something really difficult and really traumatic. which we'll kind of talk about later, like the impact of doing something when you didn't consent is so horrible. So as a result, what we say to students, and I think this is a really important message to kind of reiterate to young people, is if you're ever engaging in relationships and or sexual activity, it's so important that you get to the green side, because and you make sure and you know that both people are comfortable and you know that both people have consent. Because if we're not careful and we potentially go ahead with something in the grey area, we don't know until the next day or afterwards that it turns out, okay, it was all good, it was green, or actually it turns out that one person really wasn't comfortable and we just didn't realise. And potentially then they have to go through something really traumatic and really difficult. Potentially as well, there might be an accusation, which obviously doesn't help anyone. So it's so important that they are always in that positive green area. And so the message from that is, if you're ever engaging in any sort of relationship or sexual activity, whenever that is, whether that's now, whether that's if far in the future, whether that's ages in the future, whether that's in marriage, whenever that situation is, just make sure that both people are comfortable. It's a positive experience for everyone, because we all deserve that, right? And you all have a responsibility to make sure that's the case. So then we have a few things that we want to add to that legal definition as part of enthusiastic consent. So we already had the kind of top two, so freely given and given with capacity. We also say consent should be specific, ongoing and reversible, and informed. So essentially, specific consent, that means you consent to a specific act and not necessarily anything else. So someone might consent to one sexual act but not to something different. Someone might consent to going somewhere private with someone, or like up to their room, and we might think it's going to go further, but that doesn't necessarily mean it would. So if you do want to move on to something different, you still need to make sure everyone's comfortable. And equally, the other side of that is, just because you've consented to one thing, you don't have to feel obliged to go ahead with something different. Then ongoing and reversible just means that consent has to be like in the moment, throughout an act, and anyone can change their mind at any point. So let's say people in a relationship have engaged in something multiple times before, doesn't mean we can assume that they would consent again in that moment. Also, someone might change their mind halfway through, decide they're not enjoying it anymore, and the other person has to respect that. So obviously we have every right to express that we don't want to do something, or we've changed our mind, and the other person needs to obviously like listen to us and respect how we feel. The final one is informed, which just means that everyone's aware of what they're consenting to. And if there's any information that might change their mind, then they need to be made aware of that. So there are a couple of things that are important to mention here, and we tend to mention these with the older students, sort of year 11 above. And that's basically, if someone has an STI, then they're legally required to tell their partner before engaging in sexual activity. And also everyone has to be on the same page about the use of contraception and or birth control. So an example of this would be something called stealthing in the UK, which is where people who agree to have sex with a condom, one person will remove that without telling the other person and carry on going. And that's technically classed as rape in the UK, because it takes it from informed consent about the use of protection with condom to uninformed consent. As we say to students, the message here is not that they have to be really robotic and always ask very verbally and very clearly, can I do this now? Are you okay with this? Are you still enjoying this? Blah, 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 and like constantly be like a robot, because I think as adults we can all understand that that's not realistic. And also we can all understand that people might want to make things fun and spontaneous and exciting, and they don't want to kill the mood. And young people will often talk about that as well, finding ways to make sure you have consent without making it really boring. So we're not saying that they have to be like that, to be like a robot. Obviously, in some situations, verbal consent and very clear communication is really important. But if they're not going to ask certain questions very clearly, then they do need to still make sure that everyone's still comfortable and everyone's still on the same page. And so often we talk about body language being really important, being attentive to how the other person feels, making sure we're, not going too quickly in certain situations, and kind of building that trust and creating a safe space with each other. A big part of that is understanding that, we want everyone to feel able to communicate themselves, express their boundaries, and say whether they want to do something or not. It's all well and good us sort of saying, yeah, you can say no at any point if you don't want to, or you can change your mind. But if someone doesn't feel sort of safe to do that, then that's going to be really difficult. So a big part of it is just creating like a safe and respectful environment for each other when we're in those situations, so that everyone is able to then actually communicate how they feel because also if you don't necessarily communicate how you feel, it's going to be difficult for your partner to know that as well. Like, we can't read each other's minds, so it's a two-way street in those situations. So from that's kind of what we talk about with consent and the important parts of that. The second part then is to go through what sexual violence is, and therefore, I guess, what we need to be aware of with these kind of things. We'll give the definitions with this. They're not always the most helpful, as you'll kind of see. So again, the main message has always just got to be positivity, in my opinion. I think if we just aim for a positive environment, we aim for positive situations, then consent will be there and no one's going to get hurt. And I think that's really important. But we'll go through these, and again, if there are any questions at the end, please let me know. The first one is sexual harassment. So that's essentially any unwanted conduct of a sexual nature that makes someone feel uncomfortable, humiliated, or offended. Examples: catcalling, wolf whistling, unwanted comments about someone's body, things like that. With particularly sort of year 9, year 10, we do often go into / get questions around, okay, well, how do I compliment someone, or how can I go up to someone I like and tell them that I like them? Because there is a worry now amongst young people that if they do that, they're going to get told off for harassing someone. So what we try and make clear is, obviously, it's absolutely fine for people to engage with each other in that way. It's absolutely fine for people to ask people out and to say you like them, this, that, and the other. That's not a problem. We're never trying to get across the fact that you shouldn't do that. It's just important then to make sure that we're being respectful about it. So what we tend to say is, what's the difference between a compliment and flirting / harassment? Is if harassment or compliments and flirting are, one, they are generally received well, so the other person is happy to hear what you said and is okay to receive it. They are appropriate, so they're not a very sort of crude and unwanted comment about someone's, maybe just a body part, for example. They're done at an appropriate time as well, linked to that. And they're in general similar to that, kind of respectful / generally respectful. Versus harassment would be if it's unwanted, so the person doesn't want to receive that compliment, if it's very inappropriate and or rude, and maybe if it's persistent when it's unwanted. So that's the kind of the second part of that, is saying, okay, well, if you do ask someone out and you do give someone a compliment and you've done it in the right way and you've been respectful about it, etc., and then they don't receive it very well and they're like, actually, and they seem uncomfortable, or they say no, or they reject you or whatever, that's going to hurt your feelings. But if you then carry on going again and again and again, that could be when it comes harassment. / if you go up to someone and just give a very crude comment about a body part, also that's probably going to be more likely to be harassment. So those are the kind of main things we talk about there. It's mainly about the impact, if it makes someone feel uncomfortable, offended, or humiliated. Sexual assault is more physical, so we call that someone intentionally touching someone else in a sexual way without consent, or forcing them to touch you in a sexual way without consent. In general, there is also the non-physical element of sexual assault, which would be forcing someone to watch certain sexual acts as well, would be classed as sexual assault. And then finally, rape. So the legal definition of rape is the penetration with a penis of the vagina, anus, or mouth of another person without their consent. So technically, under the eyes of the law, rape can only be committed by someone with a penis. Now, that we tend to, for students, we tend to just give the definition of penetrative sex without consent because it's a lot more helpful, and it doesn't raise the issue of people saying, okay, well, that's unfair because it means a man can't be raped by a woman, which is also why I said at the beginning, the legal definitions aren't always particularly helpful. It just is what it is. Obviously, society-wise, if a male were to be forced into having sex by a female, most of us probably would call that rape, and we would all understand that it's not okay and it's wrong. So the main thing to think about with these definitions is not, okay, what this means that, and this definition equals this. It's just to understand that all three of those things happen when there's no consent, and all three of them have very serious impacts on the victim, which is why they're wrong. The ultimate thing is these things, like sex and relationships, should be positive. It should be enjoyable for everyone involved. Therefore, if we get this wrong and we don't have consent, then it can have a really serious impact, which is why we don't want to be doing it. Not necessarily because it's defined as X, Y, or Z. On from that, we then need to talk about the online stuff as well. And so there's a few things to mention with this, which obviously we've talked to students about as well. So when we think about kind of sexual acts online, the most important thing, again, in our opinion, is that there is consent involved. So if people are going to choose to express themselves in that way and share images with each other or share nude pictures or videos or whatever it is so important that there is consent. No one is ever forced into sending something. No one is ever pressured into sending something. And let's say people did choose to share these kind of things, it's then really important that we understand there's only ever consent for one person to see that. It's never okay to show it to anyone else, to send it to a different group chat, to publish it online, or anything like that, because that has a really, really serious impact on the victim in that situation. And that's kind of what would be classed as revenge porn, which is the second line down there. If someone were to share some explicit pictures of someone else without their consent with the intent to cause harm or distress, that would be classed as revenge porn. I think they've recently reworded that law as well, so that it no longer needs the intent to cause harm or distress. Just a flat out sharing sexual pictures of someone else without their consent would be classed as illegal. The other thing is cyber flashing, which is sending someone else sexual images when they haven't consented to receive that image. So that could be an image of yourself. If you send a sexual image of yourself to someone when they didn't want it, that's not okay. And also it could also be just a sexual picture off the internet. Then what's important to go through in this situation is also the law around age with images. So I'll kind of go through that and then go through the certain ramifications with that as well. In the UK, it is illegal to send, create, or possess sexual images of someone who's under the age of 18. So by that definition, even if people were in a relationship and they were legally sexually active as well, let's say older than 16, and they chose to express themselves in this way by sharing pictures with each other, they would both be doing something against the law because they're under the age of 18. Now, similar to the age of consent law, that law is there to protect young people from abuse. Again, it's that it was originally created to stop the spread of child pornography. It was created in 2003 before smartphones were widespread or even invented, I think. And as a result, it wasn't there to stop people healthily expressing themselves in this way. So what would tend to happen if the two young people were sort of caught sharing images with each other and they were both consenting to it, again, the police would probably decide, quote unquote, it's not in the public interest to prosecute. However, given that law, if then something were to go wrong and someone's images were to be leaked or shared without their consent, not only would that be classed as revenge porn, but is also classed as distributing child pornography. So it can make it even more serious. So as a result, the main thing is just to understand that there's consent. And I think also as parents, you probably understand that what we want to do is make sure we protect young people. So understanding that there can be pressures potentially to engage in this kind of thing in a relationship, and also maybe they might be interested in doing so as well. However, can be helpful to let students know, that let young people and children know that obviously if they do tend to share an image, they don't necessarily have control over that anymore because it's been sent to someone else. Now, that's why if people wanted to express themselves in that way, it's really important to then make sure there's extra trust, extra communication about these kind of things. And if they're in any doubt, they never, ever have to share anything. They should never feel pressured. And I think that's really important, is empowering young people to understand their rights and to understand that if someone maybe is pressuring them to send something, that is never okay. It's never their fault, and they should probably not excuse that sort of behavior. That's quite a significant red flag, as if someone in a relationship was pressuring someone else to send or share pictures. So obviously it's a very difficult thing to think about, but it's important that we're aware of these issues because obviously people are spending more and more time online these days, and I think that's only going to become, they're going to spend more time in the future. So it's important that we're kind of on top of that and making sure we're aware of people's relationships online and making sure they can, keep themselves as safe and healthy as possible in those situations as well. So the last thing I kind of want to talk about as well when it comes to the definitions of sexual violence, and this is what I talked about a bit before, is kind of providing wider context, is that when we think about sexual violence, we think about rape and sexual assault, they don't just happen in and of themselves. It's not like it's not like someone wakes up and decides, okay, I'm going to commit this today. As we said before, most of the time this happens amongst people who know each other. Most of the time it's in a relationship, or it's young people expressing themselves in this way or exploring their sexuality who get it wrong and make a mistake. And when you look at so many of the cases and testimonies that come up, often they're not trying to hurt someone else. They're just not necessarily being careful enough, or not necessarily thinking about the other person in that situation. So what we're looking at here is basically, why does sexual violence exist and why is it so common in our society? So as if you think about it like a pyramid, as I'm going to try and show here, essentially the physical expressions of sexual violence, so things like rape and sexual assault, happen at the top. They're like relatively not very common as the attitudes and beliefs are, and also they're like the tip of the iceberg. They're the most serious things, right? They basically are caused, or the foundation for those things are certain attitudes and beliefs that society doesn't necessarily hold, but at least doesn't condemn on a wide scale. And as a result, there are certain attitudes and beliefs which, if they become normalized and we don't call them out and we don't challenge them, that leads to people potentially expressing those verbally, through language or through conversations or in whatever situation. And if we don't challenge that and we leave that to become normal and people think that's okay, then it's going to lead to people thinking that either they're entitled to some form of sexual activity, or that they were excused to do something without consent, or not even that, that they were just not necessarily thinking clearly about consent. So, and this isn't just me saying this, by the way, that there's a lot of research that shows that cultures with certain attitudes and beliefs are more likely to have higher levels of rape and sexual assault. And also people who hold these attitudes and beliefs are more likely to go on to commit acts of sexual aggression. So to fill that in, essentially what we have is obviously at the top, clear examples of sexual violence. And at the bottom, the attitudes that can kind of lead to that. So in particular, a lot of academic research shows that if there are high levels of hostile attitudes towards women, so misogyny in a society, high sort of rigid and harmful gender roles, and also high levels of objectification, you tend to get higher levels of rape and sexual assault. And on top of that, people who have those attitudes, plus also accept rape myths and blame victims to a high extent, are also more likely to go on to commit things as well. So what we're trying to say with that is it's really important to challenge this stuff at the bottom as well as the stuff at the top, because also, if you think about it, practically speaking, you're not very likely to ever see or witness anything near the top. But we've all probably heard multiple times, and young people definitely will have heard all that stuff at the bottom. So we can't challenge really the stuff at the top until it's happened, but we can challenge the attitudes, and we really must make sure we call that stuff out as well. So making sure that we're not treating people like objects, because that means that we dehumanize them and we don't necessarily think about what they want in a sexual situation, which means consent can become more difficult. Making sure we're aware of sexism and what that looks like, and making sure that we don't accept it as well, because that can lead to significant issues. And then sort of to elaborate on the harmful gender stereotypes one, sometimes people talk about this by saying sort of quote unquote toxic masculinity. The last thing I ever want to suggest is that being masculine is bad at all. There's nothing wrong with being masculine or wanting to be traditionally masculine. The issue we see is when we say that men and women have to play certain roles in society / have to act a certain way, and then we don't allow people to not act in that way. I think the key thing is when it's very rigid and forced. So in general, what you see is if men are conditioned or supposed to act in a very sort of aggressive, dominant, risk-taking manner, and potentially praised for getting with lots of people or being very sexually active with multiple partners, / essentially outcast or bullied for the opposite. And if women are then supposed to be, you know, the traditional sense of agreeable, submissive, sort of stay at home, that kind of idea, then you've got men trying to prove masculinity because otherwise they get bullied for not doing that by getting with lots of people, by being very aggressive and dominant and risk-taking, and women who are supposed to not say no and to be agreeable and not cause trouble, sort of thing. And as a result, you can see how, again, in a sexual situation, that is not a very good environment for consent and positivity, or at least an equal environment where both people should be on the same level playing field. So that's why those things can lead to significant issues. So essentially what we're saying with this is, yes, talk about the stuff at the top and understand that that's wrong, but also talk about the things in the middle and the things in the bottom and understanding why they're wrong as well. It's quite difficult to explain that really clearly without having loads of time. So I will, this is included in the resource that I'll send round to hopefully make that a lot more clear, because it is quite important to kind of continue those sorts of conversations. From that, we kind of wanted to talk about the last two parts of what to talk about regarding consent was healthy relationships and coercion, and consent and alcohol. So I'll go through those before then going into what you can do if something were to happen to your child. So number one, we don't need to spend too long on these, but healthy relationships and coercion. What we're saying with relationships / healthy, unhealthy friendships, relationships is similar to, in general, consent and sexual activity, is just make sure that everyone understands that they involve respect for both people, that you are able to set your boundaries. Sometimes I think people think that in a relationship they should have little to no boundaries, but it's really important to be able to set those and to understand that you can have them. And also that everything involves choice. And again, linking that all in, it's like the foundation for consent is that making sure everyone's respected, everyone's comfortable, and everyone has like a choice and a say in what happens, rather than, and I think that's linking all into being an equal relationship. When you have a significant power imbalance in a relationship, that can make consent really difficult as well. So linking to that is, what does coercion look like? So coercion describes like any attempts to control or manipulate someone's behavior in a non-physical way, and unfortunately is particularly quite common amongst young people in sexual situations. So it might look like guilt tripping, so someone saying, oh, you clearly don't like me, otherwise you would do that. Making threats, emotional blackmail, so if someone says no to their partner and then their partner goes really cold on them all of a sudden, stops talking to them normally, becomes quite rude and maybe very abrupt, those kind of things, going to make someone feel really bad for saying no. Maybe social pressure, so like all the other couples are doing it, or saying like, grow up, you know, this is normal, everyone else is comfortable with this kind of thing. And then finally, relentless requests is often quite common, where someone will say no and the other person will either just ignore it and keep going, or until the other person kind of gives in and goes along with it, or they'll ask again and again and again until the other person says, okay, fine, and gives in. And none of these would count as consent if anyone says yes as a result of these. So what's really important, we say to young people, is to, one, recognize it for what it is and don't excuse it. So don't ever say, oh, they just really like me, that's why they were being like that, and anything like that. Don't, because it often starts subtle and can get really serious. So it's really important to call that out and to accept it for being coercion. And then on top of that, it's important to make sure everyone realizes as well that if they did end up being in a coercive situation, they didn't feel able to say no, it's obviously never, ever their fault. And they should hopefully ask for support in that situation, because it's only ever the fault of the person who is pressurizing it. From that, then, in terms of consent with alcohol and drugs, so this is quite a tricky one. Essentially what the law says is, if someone's incapacitated due to being under the influence of drugs or alcohol, they cannot consent. Now, obviously that still doesn't equal a clear answer. So the main message we say is just be really careful, because being under the influence of alcohol, one, reduces your ability to tell if someone else can consent, and also being under the influence of alcohol reduces your ability to be able to consent properly. So just be really careful with it. If in doubt, don't risk it, because also alcohol is involved in so many cases amongst young people. Often when you talk to police or sexual assault referral clinics, they will talk about how often when someone comes to them saying, you know, this has happened to me, I didn't consent, so much of the time alcohol is involved. So it just makes relationships and sexual activity and consent really tricky. So as I said, the law says that if you're incapacitated due to drugs or alcohol, you cannot consent. What the law also says is that whoever is initiating sexual activity, whoever's starting it, it's their responsibility to make sure the other person can consent. And on that as well, you're still responsible for your actions if you've been drinking. So young people often say, okay, well, what if both people are drunk? And it's saying, well, if you're initiating something and you're pushing something forward, you're still responsible for your actions. The same way that if you drink, you drive, you get behind the wheel of a car and you hit someone, you've still broken the law and it's still your fault. You can't say, oh, I was drunk, I didn't mean it. Same way, if you drink and you do something without someone's consent, it's still your fault. You've still committed something without someone's consent. So it's really important that you're aware that you have responsibility, and as a result, make sure we're being careful with these kind of things. In reality, we know that often these things aren't always that simple. Probably a lot of people on this call who have engaged in sexual activity whilst drunk, and understanding that it was consensual and that they were okay with that as well. And we understand that people will, and some people do, engage in sexual activity whilst drunk, and it turns out fine. So what are the things we can look out for? And in that situation, saying, okay, well, make sure, just again, be really careful and make sure. In reality, if both people have been drinking a bit, you're going to have to communicate a lot more clearly and a lot more carefully. So that's a situation where you're going to need more verbal communication to say, okay, is everyone okay? Are you sure you're comfortable with this, etc. And then also looking out for things like, can they hold a normal conversation? Are they acting as they normally would? Do you think they'd make the same decision sober? Are you both, when you're talking to them, can you tell that they're kind of in the room in terms of their understanding what you're saying, and they're kind of, giving stuff back, that kind of thing? And then particularly with the older students, what we'll talk about is, if and when you do engage in sexual activity, are they fully engaged? So is someone fully engaged in what's going on, they're doing things back, they're more likely to be, they're active in a situation, they're more likely to be giving consent, versus are they just sort of lying there, not really involved, more likely to be incapacitated? And the bottom line is, going back to that scale, if you're in any doubt, if you're in anywhere apart from this green box, if you're anywhere in that grey area, just don't risk it. There's never a rush. You can always wait till another time, make sure both people are sober, because if we get it wrong, if we make a mistake, the consequences are so serious. Like, the impact of that kind of thing is so serious. So just make sure we don't get it wrong and be careful. So to finish on is what happens, unfortunately, to talk about what happens if this were to happen to your child or to someone you know. So number one, they will what they might go through is a load of different things. I won't go through all of them, but essentially a victim of sexual violence is going to be really difficult. There's no kind of two ways about it. It's such a difficult thing to go through. It can impact people in a number of different ways. And the kind of things that are quite common is potentially blaming themselves, potential shame, potential embarrassment, definitely trauma and PTSD are very common. And that can manifest itself in lots of different ways, like constant panic attacks or not having control of your body. It can sometimes lead to sort of physical illnesses. So, for example, lots of different types that it could lead to. There's no point listing them, but it can manifest itself physically and not just mentally. Potential depression, flashbacks. Often victims may turn to things like self-harm or substance abuse, as well as potentially like isolating themselves or eating disorders. And also a victim of sexual violence, or a victim of rape at least, is 13 times more likely to attempt suicide than the average person as well. So again, I don't want to create like a really horrible situation here and say that this is all doom and gloom, but it's important to realize that these things do have really serious impacts. Obviously that links to what I'm talking about today, is why consent is so important, but also so that as a result you can be there to support if these things were to happen. So what can you do is, number one, we're going to play a video there just to go through the impact, but I don't think we're going to have too much time for that, because I appreciate we're going on for quite a while. What can you do if someone what can you do, I guess, if this does happen? Number one, believe them is so important. Is, as we already said, that people often will blame themselves and won't kind of think that what happened to them is, they'll think it's their fault, or they won't maybe label it as rape or sexual assault. So make sure we believe them to support them, because it can be so difficult for a victim to kind of come forward, which is really hard in the first place, and say that this has happened, only for the person they love to say, no, it was your fault, or I don't believe you. Remember, it's never their fault. On top of that, they'll probably blame themselves so many times, so keep reminding them of that, and remember, it's nothing they could have done to change it. It's only ever the fault of the person who did it. We're not expecting people to be professional therapists. Obviously, you're not going to have all the answers, but the thing you can do is just be there to listen and support. As I kind of talked through just there, the impact is going to be really difficult. So as long as we're there to support them through that and help them, that can be really important. And linked to that, respect their decisions. So I'll kind of go through this in a bit more depth, but there's no right or wrong way, obviously, for a survivor to respond. Sometimes people will react in ways that would be unimaginable to you, or think that that's not the right way to react. It's really important not to control it too much, because in rape and sexual assault, what's generally one of the things that can be so difficult is the victim has lost control over their own body, and as a result, being out of control in the future can also feel very difficult. So as much as we can, try and respect their decisions. Linking to that in a big time, if they don't want to report it, it's probably not the best thing to do in the moment. And on that, they must do what's right for them and how they need to heal. And obviously just making sure we're helpful and guiding. We can guide them to the best way possible, but obviously we can't necessarily control people. And counselling and therapy often can, I'm not saying it will help, but can help when they're ready for it. And obviously making sure you find the right counsellor and therapist, because often people aren't necessarily specialised to deal with those kind of things. Just to kind of go through that reporting thing again, I think this is really important, is often as a family member of someone who's gone through this, you might think, okay, we've got to report it, we've got to make sure they don't do it again. Often there's a lot of anger involved and a lot of emotions. Reporting in the UK is incredibly difficult because the way that the legal system is set up. And without going into too much depth with that, less than 2% of rapes end up in a conviction or even a charge in the UK. So it is so unlikely to get a conviction and to actually get justice for it. And the way the process goes essentially is just re-traumatizing for a victim. So it can be so difficult. So I would encourage to make sure that we don't ever force people to report if they don't want to. And also, if they are thinking about it, to make sure to look into it quite carefully, because it's not a nice thing to say, but it's and obviously we want to, ideally people would report these things whenever they happened, but it's ultimately, if this has happened, you just want the person who's been a victim to get better, and it's sometimes not going to help them get better. What you can do is go to a sexual assault referral clinic, which I'll mention in the resource as well that I'll send over. And that enables you to collect evidence and seek advice in the moment. And then you always have that evidence for later on if you wanted to report later down the line when you felt more able, which a lot of people do. So that's everything I've gone through. Thanks so much for listening. That's probably took a little bit longer than probably was expected, so I'm sorry about that. But hopefully it was very helpful. As I said, I'll send any resources over. If anyone wanted the website you wanted to look at, and it's talkconsent.org, there's summaries of all the content we deliver. If any parent wanted to see like the slides that we deliver to students, I'm more than happy to send as well. I think the teachers have access so they can pass them on. But yeah, thank you so much for listening and being patient with me. I'll stop sharing now so that I can see, and if people have any questions, then
thanks, Dan. That was great, and we will share the resources. I'm going to stop the recording so that people can ask questions without being recorded, but thank you so much again.
Thank you.